Awesome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, I should say, for our doctoral symposium on the Institutional Review Board. This is something you will have to do once you get ready to start on your dissertation, and once you get ready to begin that research. You will have to put an IRB proposal in, and it has to be approved through our IRB board and everything to make sure before you can begin that research. So keep that in mind. There may be, Dr. Street will also talk about some other IRB, especially if you work with school districts and those kinds of things, some other IRB processes you may have to go through as well. So keep that in mind. We are recording this, so that way everybody should have access to it. We'll give you a link to it through Ashley Murden tomorrow morning. And Dr. Street, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over and let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I think y'all all saw, but there is a poodle, 6-month-old poodle running around. So if she gets loud, y'all tell me, but she's either going to be scratching on the door or jumping on the bed. So we're just going to let her do that. But my name is Cassidy Street. I am the Human Research Protection Program Manager. And so as the HRPP, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what the HRPP is, we're kind of the go-between between the researcher and the IRB review board, the ones that are actually reviewing your stuff for the ethical consideration of it, and making sure that like we're following what our government is telling us to do, what we're following what our state is telling us, as well as Texas Tech. So we're kind of the in-between person, the middleman. And so I oversee that office, and so I'm just always here to help our researchers as well as our reviewers. So I'm the manager. Our IRB chair, we just switched. On Tuesday was the last day for Dr. Kelly Sakrowitz to be the IRB chair. So we now have a new IRB chair, Dr. Martin Binks. This is the first time that we've had an IRB chair in a very long time that is outside of the psychology department. Dr. Martin Binks is actually in nutritional sciences, so a part of y'all's college. So that's pretty cool for y'all to have somebody within y'all's college be the IRB chair. I have April Ortegon's name on this slide because she's one of our analysts. And so she typically helps me do these presentations when we do this series especially. And then we also have Marcela Ramirez that's also an analyst in our office. So just, don't be afraid to give us a call, email us anytime. I know y'all are doctoral students. My only request is that when you do contact us that you include your PI. So you're typically your chair of your dissertation committee on that communication with us, so we can always make sure that we're on the same page, because it never fails. Every once in a while I'll be talking to a doctoral student and they're interpreting what their PI has told them, and then you talk to the PI and you're like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I want to do this. And so it changes it. So it's just always better for all of us to be on the same communication with that. So, and y'all can see my slides, correct? Okay, awesome. So the first thing I want to kind of clarify is that there are a lot of types of research. Some involve human subjects, some don't involve human subjects. But when I say, human subject research, I'm referring back to what our federal government has defined as human subject research. So we're going to talk about, we don't talk a lot about case studies, but for example, a case study doesn't require an IRB approval. Dr. Robertson, when he was going through the PhD program, I know that like he did an autoethnography, and so we didn't do an IRB approval on that. And so just because I say that's not research, I don't mean to ever offend anybody. It just doesn't mean our federal definition of human subject research. And so the first thing that you have to define is that what is a human subject? So we're only talking about living individuals. So if somebody has passed away and they've donated their body to science, that does not fall under my jurisdiction. I just think that's kind of fascinating and neat, but I only deal with living people. And so a living individual about whom an investigator, and that could be, a student, a faculty member, a staff member, is going to be obtaining information or even biospecimens from an individual. And when we think of an intervention, that's not necessarily just like an experiment. That could be a survey, that could be an interview, an observation even, where you don't even talk to an individual, but you're watching what their activity is happening in a public place. That could be an intervention or an interaction. And that you're going to use that private identifiable information or biospecimens for that matter, and you're going to analyze it and study it. And so kind of where the private identifiable information, I think, is what confuses the majority of the researchers. Because when we look at private identifiable, that means like personal information, something that you have to tell somebody or that you have to give somebody access to look at that information on you. So a good example of this is Twitter. And social media is so controversial right now when it comes to doing research with it. I mean, I feel like it's on the news every single day. But like tweets, for example, for the most part, are public information. My mother has absolutely no social media account whatsoever, but I can tell her to Google something and she can pull up tweets. And so that's publicly available information. That is not considered private identifiable information. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is more of the private information. If it's public, it doesn't fall under our jurisdiction. And then just a couple of examples, because I do like to point this out, of different types of data collection. Everybody always says, well, I'm doing an anonymous survey through Qualtrics, so I don't need an IRB. No, you still need an IRB. It's just going to go through a different review type. So surveys always throws people off. Observations is another one that kind of catches people. On the right side of the screen, the column, that's typically what we think of when we think about human subject research. That's the biomedical world a lot of times. The other side is focusing more on the social behavioral, which I think is the majority of what y'all's college and specifically y'all's department handles. So the second part of that definition is you have to define what research is. And it has to be a systematic investigation. So where you are looking at answering your research questions, maybe you have a theory that's driving your research and you're looking into that. And then you're hoping to take that systematic investigation, those findings, and you're wanting, to test, evaluate, design, all of that kind of stuff, and then contribute to generalizable knowledge. And generalizable knowledge, the systematic investigation, that's a pretty easy, that's easy to identify that that's research. It's the generalizable knowledge that actually gets very difficult to determine if it is generalizable or not. And so I believe it was the University of Wisconsin had these 4 points of what they defined as generalizable knowledge. And I think this is a good, easy sounding board for us to use. A lot of IRBs will go with the easy answer of what generalizable knowledge is, and they just are like, anything that's published or presented on is going to be generalizable knowledge. Well, that's a little bit stretch, right? And so this is why I like these 4 points. So you're going to use the information and it's going to contribute to a theoretical framework or an established body of knowledge. You're going to add to the material that's already there. You want to look at who are the people that may benefit from it. And so it could be researchers, it could be scholars, practitioners, whoever it might be. That one's pretty easy to fit almost in every area of research, that you can see who the people are that would benefit from your research. The third thing, this is the simple one, it's the publication, the presentations. How are you going to be getting that message out about your research? The fourth one is the kicker. The fourth one is what typically throws it out of generalizable knowledge. But you're going to be able to take your results, your systematic investigation, and put it into a different scenario, and you should be able to get very similar results. And so if you can't get similar results, then it can't be generalizable knowledge. And so College of Education is a good example. Even I think within the family and consumer science, it's a good example when we think about an educational setting. So if you're looking into a specific problem in a specific school and you are investigating that, but it is so precise and specific to that school that you couldn't replicate it in another setting, then it's not generalizable knowledge. Another example too, and I know this is an extreme, but it's a kind of a good way to think about it, is in visual and performing arts, we have a lot of artists over there, researchers that are artists, and they like to interview, you know, say somebody that's struggling with depression. And they ask them questions about, like, what does depression make you feel like? You know, if you could describe it, you know, how would you do it? If it was artwork, what would it look like? And so based from that interview, that researcher then takes their interview responses and creates a piece of art. And that's the findings of it, is a piece of art. That can't be replicated, because the 6 of us on this call could take those interview questions and responses, and we would create something totally different in every type of scenario of art. You know, there is no way our stuff would all look similar. And so that's just kind of an example of what we're looking at when we talk about the results are intended to be replicated. So you're going to take that same systematic investigation and be able to apply it to that target population and hopefully get the same type of results. So anyways, just a kind of a little bit about generalizable knowledge. It's probably one of the hardest things sometimes to decide when it comes to an IRB. Just really quickly, there are a couple of things that it doesn't require an IRB, and I want to go over that. So like teacher-student evaluations, those are not generalizable knowledge, so they don't need IRB. That is specific to a particular person. It's a program evaluation. It's not meant to contribute to an established body of knowledge. Any type of program evaluation for internal purposes is same thing. It's not generalizable. You're looking at a specific problem within a specific group. That doesn't mean that you couldn't necessarily talk about it, but it can't be generalized. Classroom projects. This is, I know we're doctoral students, but I always have faculty members that want to do a classroom project in their class and they want them to get an IRB. And you don't need it. That's your learning experience. That's you figuring out how to be a researcher. And it's very hard to get an IRB approved in the amount of 1 semester and your data collected and findings all ready to go. Journalism, so media and communications, ad communications, they do not require an IRB when it's solely for journalism. Oral histories and art too, as well. And I think like all of these, there's all a little bit of a systematic investigation, even into journalism. There is a systematic investigation that happens with this activities, but it's applying it to the generalizable knowledge that makes it difficult. So de-identified data. So if somebody would give you de-identified data, you know, the Texas Education Agency is a great example. We have a lot of data that comes from there. However, they're giving us de-identified data. Even though it's private and behind locked doors, they're still giving us de-identified data, and that does not require an IRB approval. My degree is in agriculture, so I apologize if I refer back to agriculture quite a bit. But I think about when we, sometimes in ag, we'll have research that involves a faculty member contacting a cotton ginner, and we want to know like how many bales did you gin, what was the yield, what was the color, what was the grade, all of that kind of stuff. Just because they talked to a person does not mean that that is human subject research. Yeah, a human gave you the information, but it is not about a human. And so if you use a human to gather information about an object or a thing or an entity, that does not require IRB approval. So that's kind of a quick rundown about what human subject research is. And you have to understand that before you can really move on to the other pieces. So before I move on, do y'all have any questions?
With that, Cassidy, what if you were focusing on kind of like the scholarship of research and teaching, and so you were maybe evaluating a class, looking at course assignments, looking at reflective assignments, etc. with the intent of submitting it for publication? Like, when is that?
Yeah, and it's hard, and it's one of those things, like, I tell you everything what the definition of human subject research is, and sometimes the easiest thing is just to go ahead and get an IRB approval for it, so that way you're covered. Because with generalizable knowledge, it's all going to be about how you spin it when you do the presentation. And if you're like, this is research, this is not, if you never say program evaluation and you call it research the entire time you're writing it up, and you make it look like generalizable knowledge, then you're going to need an IRB at that point. And most journals anymore are starting to request some type of like notification or something. But with what you are describing, and we're going to go through the exempt categories because I think they're important to know, and a good, once again, sounding board. But there's an exempt category 1, which is a normal classroom experience. And that allows you to look at those course grades, those assignments, those reflections, all of that kind of good stuff. I would say that anytime we are using student work, and even in a reflection, we've got to be so careful to protect the identity of that participant. And so I never want to see like a paragraph from a reflection, of a student's work. Because here at Texas Tech, when we do a normal classroom experience, we don't get consent or assent from the student. And the reason that we do that is we believe that if we introduce those assignments, those test grades as research, then all of a sudden we're giving the opportunity for the student to be able to say, hey, I'm not going to do this coursework because it's research purposes. And as we'll talk about in a minute, all research has to be voluntary. They have to have the opportunity to skip out. And so one of our biggest jobs as the IRB is to remove coercion and undue influence. And as soon as we tell a student that it's research, we're actually introducing coercion and undue influence into the classroom. And so just reflections, anytime I hear reflections, it kind of always makes me a little bit nervous because I think you have to protect the identity of the student so much. Just recently, one of our IRB reviewers, he contacted me, and they created poems in the classroom. And then one of his students is actually a teacher as well, and they also created poems in the classroom. So this was one of the instances where once the semester is over and he has decided what poems he wants to use for research, he's actually going to contact the students to see if he can use their poems, not necessarily for the research. Everything else has been for research, but for the demonstration. And we typically never allow names to go, of participant names, but in this case, because it was a piece of art, essentially, we have said that they need to put the names of the child onto the poem. So anyways, that was a little bit of a ramble. I apologize for that, but as I think of examples, I just kind of talk about them. So, but yeah, we can talk about that in just a little bit. Anything else? Okay, so I'm going to just go over this very, very quickly. The Institutional Review Board, it is made up of various amounts and different groups of people within Texas Tech, outside of Texas Tech. I will tell you, as a doctoral student, I always want to tell y'all this. The people that are actually reviewing your stuff and saying whether it is good, bad, ethical, not ethical, they are faculty reviewers. So it never fails. We always have one person once a semester, I think, go into a faculty member's office and they're complaining about the IRB, and they're complaining to their IRB reviewer. So please just note that they are faculty members. This is a part of their service. I don't know if y'all have talked about the service of a faculty member, but it's not a paid position. And I would argue that this is the hardest service that a faculty member can do on the campus. So our reviewers our newbies get one new IRB a week, And our seasoned veterans probably get about 5 a week. So they're super busy. And just to let you know, this is kind of what we do. We can approve, we can disapprove, we can go in and monitor your research, suspend, terminate, all that kind of good stuff, I guess. Not good stuff. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And then our office, and we do maintain the records. I will tell you this as a doctoral student, make sure that when you do the IRB, you save all records of it. So whether it's an IRB approval letter, it's your consent forms, your recruitment material, protocol, even if it's an email from me that says you do not need IRB approval for this type of project, keep all of that documentation with you. Take it with you when you leave Texas Tech, because a lot of these journals, publications may require some type of proof. And so just really important for you to keep. Okay, so the 3 basic principles. There's 2 documents that really guide our IRB. And the first one is 45 CFR 46. It's the Code of Federal Regulations. That's where we get the definition of human subject research from. It's the one that tells us what the makeup of the IRB is. Then there's another one, and it's called the Belmont Report. And these identify 3 basic ethical principles that kind of guide human subject research. A lot of biomedical research follows the Helsinki is one. And so, but those all focus more on biomedical. The Belmont focuses more on the social behavioral research. And so the first one is respect for persons. All of these principles are very well, yeah, I would expect somebody to treat me that way. So there's nothing shocking about any of these principles. But respect for persons is the first one, and we do expect participants to volunteer to participate in research. They should never be forced to participate in research. The other aspect of it is that we do expect you to respect their privacy. And privacy is from the beginning of the research project all the way to the end when you are publishing your research. And so I had a researcher contact me today, and he wanted to do research, interviews and surveys with LGBTQ plus youth. And he was like, how difficult is this going to be? And I was like, well, it's not, it can be done, but it's definitely, you've got to work through the logistics of how you are even going to recruit, because how you recruit these participants, you may be potentially outing these participants. So you've got to be very careful as soon as you start recruiting, consenting, even where you're going to do the interview, because doing an interview in a coffee shop, somebody can overhear your conversation. So it's thinking through that whole privacy statement, and not just how you're storing the data, but how are you protecting the privacy all the way through. I kind of joke about this, but in a way I'm kind of serious, because we have a lot of researchers that are like, well, the participant doesn't care if they're identified or not. Well, if they want to be identified, or you feel the need to identify them, I don't think you're really doing research at that point. You're doing journalism, you're doing an oral history, because our research should eliminate any type of bias. And so once you start identifying who somebody is, and they're like, well, they're an expert in the field. Well, that's introducing a bias, because you may feel like they're an expert in the field, but Dr. Miller may think they are not the expert in the field. And so it's really important that we protect their privacy. Sorry, Dr. Miller, I'll use all of y'all's names. So the other aspect of it is that you have to be fully informed about the research. And that starts from the time you start recruiting to that actual consent process. So making sure that they are aware and clear of what, the research is expected of them, how long it's going to take, what are the benefits, what are the risks, what's the purpose of the research, how are you protecting their privacy? All of that kind of information needs to be in there. And by fully informing them about the research, they can make an independent decision from the researcher to decide if they would like to participate or not. I think COVID-19, I mean, it's been a pain this entire year for sure. I think one of the things that's been nice about it from my perspective, for my job, is I think people kind of get research ethics now. We realize that there is, you know, the FDA that's looking out for us, that there's researchers looking out for us. And so at the same time, I think there's some people that are maybe hesitant to get the vaccine because of unethical research that has been done in the past. And so I think it's our job as researchers, as an IRB, to make sure that we do our research in an ethical manner and that we do fully inform our participants about the research so that we are not the ones to blame. And I think, you know, you may be going, well, we're social behavioral. We have nothing to do with biomedical, but it's our actions that influences somebody's decision, a participant, to also participate in future research. And they don't see a difference in biomedical or social behavioral. It's all the same to them. So just a little bit of my input on that. One of the other things too, our federal government has outlined like additional protections, and that's for children, prisoners, and pregnant women and fetuses. And they have guidelines that we have to follow. Like Dr. Robertson does prison research. And so when prisoners involved, they have to go before a full board. They cannot go an easy route through exempt or expedited. At the same time, those are the defined added protections. But what I will tell somebody is that any group or population could potentially turn into a protected population. And like using that example of that LGBTQ plus youth, I said, I think it can go expedited. However, depending on the questions that you're asking and your methods, it could be moved to a full board because we feel like they needed additional protections. Every once in a while, we'll get athlete research here on the tech campus, and it is very close to going to a full board because we feel like that population does need to be protected. So just think, you know, keep in mind, more than likely your population is fine, but depending on your data collection, your recruitment, you could switch them to an added protection population. So the next principle is beneficence, and it's do no harm. Like, obviously, we don't want y'all to hurt anybody. And that's where we have to maximize the benefits and minimize the risk. Going back to that LGBTQ plus example, that involving youth, when I was talking to the researcher, I said, you're going to have to tell me what is the direct benefit to that youth. Because one of the things when LGBTQ plus youth are involved, we typically have to get assent from the child and then consent from the parent. Well, in this case, this youth were not out to their parents. So if we consent them to do a research study about LGBTQ plus youth, we're outing them to their parents. There is a very high risk that we're creating for this individual because of our research. And so I was telling him, you've got to tell me what the direct benefit is to this participant. And it's that general statement that we all like to use of like, this could potentially help somebody in the future and it's going to contribute to generalizable knowledge. That's not going to work with this population. You got to tell me how it is helping this child right now, because the risk of this research is greater than the benefits of it. And so that's where we have to look at the benefits and risk. And situations change. When COVID started happening, we had a lot of research on this campus that was not risky research, but because of COVID, it made it more risky. And so we had to adjust. I remember one, and it's one from Human Sciences, and they do, I've gone blank on the data collection, but it's like mapping, and they tell you, like, they give you directions and you have to go find like a certain location, and they had it happening on the campus. it's no risk research. Well, when COVID started happening and we're going to send you walking around the campus, probably not the best thing to be doing at that point. So we had to make some changes to it. So when we talk about risk, the other thing to consider is that we're not just talking like physical harm. I think that's where we all jump to, but we've got to look at the psychological harm, the social harm, the economic, and the legal harm. So making sure that they are protected in any type of sense. And the other thing that we look at is that it's no greater than your normal daily life. And what we have to remember on that is that my normal daily life is not the same as Nicole's daily life or Dr. Miller's daily life or Dr. Robertson's daily life. Our past experiences and our current situations have created our normal daily life. So when some of our researchers do research with children that have been sexually molested by a parent, you know, our brain just shoots off of like, this is risky research, this is awful. Well, that situation that child has been to has changed their life completely. So if they're meeting with a therapist to talk about that situation and that therapist is also collecting research on it, it doesn't increase their risk because their life has completely changed because of the events that have happened in it. And so that's really what we try to look at as well. So the last one is justice. I think on a college campus, this is probably one of our most difficult ones to follow. And it's because we like to use our college students as human participants. But we have to make sure that when we do our research that we're getting an equal selection of subjects and that we're looking at the inclusion, exclusion criteria and making sure that it's answering the research questions that we need. And that we're not just selecting a population because it's convenient. And I understand that convenient sampling happens, but why is it that you need convenient sampling versus like a specific population? And I think, you know, looking back at COVID-19 and when we were doing the clinical trials for it, you know, that is why it is so important, you know, when they were making those selections, like that you're getting, you know, 50% male, 50% female. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be 50%, but it needs to be reflective of the population that it impacts. So breast cancer is a good example of this. Breast cancer affects more women than men. There are some cases where men have been impacted by breast cancer. So when we do clinical research with breast cancer, we need to make sure that our target population, our participants are reflective of the general population. The other thing that we have to look at is the coercion and undue influence, that we are not targeting participants that are being forced or feel like that if they participate in research that they're going to get an easier time. Best example are prisoners for this case. And that is why in all of our consent forms with prisoners, it says that your participation in this research will not affect your like a probation hearing. I can't think of the exact wording, but it's basically saying like, if you participate in research, like you're not going to have it easier. Like we're not going to, you know, let you out earlier. And so we've got to always look at that type of stuff. The other thing is making sure that the reward that we're giving them, whether it's a gift card, money, you know, course credit, is not excessive or inappropriate to where they're like, you know what, I don't really care if you're going to chop off my arm. I need $50,000. So thank you. You know, we've got to make sure that it's appropriate for what they're being asked to do. The other thing, and this is difficult sometimes for our researchers, but you cannot hold out that award based on whether they finish the research or not. Because once you're holding out that award for completion of the study, then that is coercion or undue influence. And so if you have a study that may take a long time, we would suggest that you kind of do prorating. And so for this task, they're getting paid $5. This task is another $5 and do it that way. So that way you're not, one, so they don't consent and you're having to give them $25 without doing nothing, but to keep them motivated going the entire time. So, the other thing too that I would say is that you've got to make sure that, especially if we're talking like control groups. So if a control actually benefited or didn't, or your intervention group benefited from the research, then you have to go back to that population that did not receive the intervention and be able to give them that benefit. So with the COVID-19 vaccines, I do know that some people, actually an IRB person up in New York, she signed up to do one of the COVID-19 vaccines. She doesn't know which one she's like is in the clinical trial with. They won't tell her. But there is a potential that she got the placebo for it. And so she's still having to go through, like she's had the COVID-19 vaccine, but she could potentially have the placebo. And clearly we all know that the vaccine is working successfully. So when the clinical trial is over, if she received the placebo, they will have to go back to her and offer her the vaccine. So just little things to kind of keep in mind. I will say giving them back the benefits if they're not a part of that group sometimes is difficult, especially when we're doing education research, because you maybe have done an intervention for an entire semester to see if your teaching method works better. Well, at the end of the semester, if the intervention group did better than the other group, like you're not going to be able to be like, hey, I need you to re-enroll in this class so you can take it again and get the better intervention, you know? So we've got to kind of consider that stuff. So those are the three basic principles, nothing shocking, right? All pretty common sense stuff. One of the things too that I will kind of talk to y'all about as a doctoral student is kind of research team members that you'll see in Cayuse IRB. So a principal investigator here at Texas Tech has to be a faculty member or somebody that is an employee with a full-time terminal degree. And so I know some institutions allow graduate students to be the PI, but here at Tech, it has to be a faculty member. And I will stress that it's important for you to talk with your PI, your faculty member, or your dissertation chair is a lot of times who it is, to make sure that your research is in the right area and that you have it completely planned out. I think it's better to do your proposal first with your committee and get it all worked out and then submit the IRB. If you use the IRB submission process as your proposal, it's not going to go very smoothly because your proposal, your IRB submission is going to be changing and our feedback is not going to be accurate. And so a lot of times when you start to craft the IRB, if you change one little aspect of it, it drastically changes what the IRB is needing. And I think Dr. Robertson, I think you are a great example of this. You know, when he submitted for his dissertation, it was going to have to go full board because he was looking at all of this, you know, his interactions with prisoners and guards and all of this kind of stuff. And then he started changing the words and we started realizing it was a true reflection on himself. And then we came back and said, not human subject research. So it's very important that you follow, kind of think through everything and make it clear in your IRB, because if it doesn't come out clear in your IRB, it's definitely, it's going to add a lot of stress to y'all. So the primary contact it can be the PI or it can be a graduate student. So that's not too picky. But what I will say is all graduate students will need to be listed as a co-investigator on the IRB. And I think y'all I've touched on this a little bit, but the PI is the one responsible for the research. Ultimately, it is their research. I know it may be for your dissertation, but at Texas Tech, it is the PI's research, and they are the one responsible for it. And that includes all aspects of it. So one of the things that I do want to kind of cover, what do we mean when you're engaged with human subject research? because a lot of times you may have a co-investigator that is just analyzing de-identified data. And if that's the case, they are not engaged in human subject research. They're engaged in research, just not the human subject side of it. And so when you start helping with recruitment, if you're consenting, collecting the data, access to private identifiable information or biospecimens, or you're analyzing that identifiable data. So if you are having any type of interaction with a human subject, or you have access to identifiers, then you are considered to be engaged in human subject research. So just kind of a little side note for that. So there are 4 levels of review. Full board, which means, you know, it's your risky research, and maybe it's a population that needs additional protections. And so those are done the last Tuesday of every month. You're assigned a primary reviewer that helps you kind of get the proposal in a good stance. And then the entire board will vote on approving your research or not. The next level is expedited. And I forgot to say this, but I feel like I need to say this. I did not come up with these names. So just because it says expedited does not mean that it is fast. Just because it's exempt doesn't mean that you don't have to submit an IRB. I don't know why our federal government won't listen to the IRBs and be like, please change these names. But anyway, so if you go expedited, it's the next. So full board's the most risky, and then the next level of risky is expedited. Most research that involves children will go, will go through the expedited review type, and it does require 2 reviewers. With the federal regulations were revised in 2018, and during that revision, they no longer require expedited proposals to have a renewal. So that's kind of nice for us. You don't have to submit every single time. So with that revision, they created a new category under expedited, which is limited review. So this is like not risky research whatsoever, but it makes your life easier if you can just collect an identifier. So that's limited review. Then you have exempt, which could be no risk research, or it could be risky research, but you're collecting it with absolutely no identifiers. If we would ever do research on illegal behavior, we typically want it to go exempt. We want it to be an anonymous data collection that you can never tie an individual back to an illegal action. And so that's a good example of like, it's pretty risky research, but because we're collecting it in an anonymous form, it eliminates the risk to it. The limited review would be more like, you know, we want to talk to a group of teachers and find out what teaching strategies are effective when working with bilingual students. And so there would really be no risk to the research, right? If there was identifiers when you collected. Now, of course, that means when publications go out, identifiers are removed. But just for your sake of collecting the data, it may be easier to collect it with identifiers. Researchers, I feel like, are always like, you know, I'm going to figure out how to collect it without identifiers because I think it's going to make the IRB process easier.
Dr. Street, can I ask a question real quick? And this is just kind of relating to something, you know, I'm doing a 3-year research study, but because of COVID-19 and working with school districts, I didn't get as many school districts as I wanted to the first round. So they're allowing me, or I should say the College of Human Sciences is allowing me to do a second round, second cohort, but it's going to extend my research into the 4th year. So do I need to redo a renewal on that side of it then?
So I think it would depend on what we put in your IRB, and I think we did pretty broad. So if you would happen to say the research will be done from 2020 to 2023, if you put a specific date, then we would need to do not a renewal, but a modification to extend that time period.
Okay.
But if we did it broad, you may not need it. So it would depend on what you put in the IRB, and I can't remember off of the top of my head. So
That's okay. That's okay. I know you see a lot of them. I was just wanting to check, but I'll check on that. And I think I may have to do a modification because we did put in there a specific year that we were going to do what we were going to do each year of that project. So I think I may have to modify that.
But I know that you joined tech after the revisions to the final rule, so it shouldn't have an expiration date on it.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, okay, so those are the 4 levels of review. I think I told y'all when the full board would be. So just to kind of let you know, just because I think this is just interesting. So at the April meeting, we approved kinesiology to do muscle biopsies. So they are going to be taking muscle biopsies from postmenopausal women. So kind of neat, just how research is evolving at Texas Tech. So expedited, like I said, so expedited is going to be not a huge risk, but maybe a little bit more risk where we need to protect the identity of participants, or you're doing a biomedical procedure out of it. This would go expedited. So sensitive information where we got to make sure that we are protecting the participants. A lot of children go through this research as well. And that's what I was going to say is, like, if it makes your life easier to collect identifiers with the data, collect the identifiers with the data. Very few times do we say the data doesn't need to be collected with identifiers, but if it makes your life easier, it's okay. Like, submit it through limited or expedited and it'll be fine. So just a couple of expedited categories. Clinical studies of drugs and medical devices. So this means that it has been FDA approved, would go through the expedited category. So when you were doing the COVID-19 vaccine, obviously that went full board because the FDA hadn't approved it. If the FDA will approve the vaccine, it's under emergency use right now, but if it will just approve it for just common shipment use and everything, then it could be researched under the expedited category currently. Blood samples under a certain amount can go expedited. Biological specimens, non-invasive procedures, and records review for research could also fall under this category. Data from voice, video, digital, or image recordings. This is very common in the human sciences. So the interviews that may be containing sensitive information would be in this category. And then any type of research that would involve looking at a group characteristic or a behavior. So that's expedited. Really quickly, because I know we're running short on time because I'm talking so much, sorry. But we've got the exempt categories. And so this means that it's minimal risk, it fits a pretty precise defined categories. And a lot of times the data is going to be anonymous. Then within that exempt is that new category, which is limited. And it'll still be called, like on your approval letter, exempt, but it just meets the limited review category. And so limited, like I said, is going to be no risk research that has identifiers collected with the data. So category 1, Nicole, this is kind of the one I think that fits what you were asking about, but this is an established or commonly accepted educational setting. This could be on student work, student activity, growth, but I also think it could be, I talked with the College of Education today, and they needed to start evaluating their instructors to make sure that their teaching methods, their feedback that they're giving their student and teachers is accurate and across the board the same. And so we were able to put it in this established or commonly accepted educational setting. So it's not just necessarily the student activity. You may be researching an instructor at the same time. Dr. Sarah Dodd, is she family and consumer sciences? Okay. So she does a lot of like program evaluation work. I know she works with the extension. I have experience with working with extension as well. And so a lot of our work does involve, it is an educational setting. It's just not a traditional educational setting. And so we do a lot of research in this category with her. Children are allowed in this exempt category. So it's a very handy category to have as an educator. I would say protect this category because I feel like we've made it pretty easy at Texas Tech to do research in this area. Some schools do make you consent and jump through a bunch of hoops to research your students. So I just ask that we protect it and make sure that, you know, we're not doing research in an area just because it's more of a convenient sampling to use our students. So. And then category 2, this could be educational tests. Children are allowed in this category. This is SAT, ACT, maybe GRE scores, IQ test, gifted and talented test, maybe even a behavioral test as well. So surveys, interviews, focus groups also fall under this category. Focus groups can now be in the exempt category through that limited review. We just ask that it's not risky research. And then observation of public behavior. If it would be observation of private behavior, then it would maybe need to go through the expedited review type. Children, I will note, are not allowed in the surveys or interviews or focus groups. So that type of research would have to go through the expedited category. So category 3 is the new one. It's benign behavioral interventions. It has to be short in duration, so you're not really going to be poking or prodding anybody. Maybe you're going to be playing like an educational game with them, a mind game. Even too, we've been putting like, you have a participant read a vignette and you want them to know how they would react in different situations. That would be a benign behavioral intervention. Nutritional sciences uses this one quite a bit. You know, you take a pre-test, you watch a video about eating habits, and then you do a post-test in 6 weeks' time. So that would be a benign behavioral intervention. Category 4, which is secondary research for which consent is not required. So this means that kind of 2 scenarios. One, the data was collected not for research purposes. So all of the student data that we have on the Tech campus, that wasn't collected for research purposes. That was for academic purposes. And so if you would want to go in and research have a research questions and you need student data, that would fall under this category 4. The key is that you would have to remove the identifiers, and the identifiers could not remain with the data. If you would need the identifiers to remain with the data, then it would go under the expedited category. The other example of a category 4 is, say that Dr. Miller is collecting all of this great data, and I'm like, hey, I also have some research questions and I would like to, you know, use your data to look into it. If Dr. Miller would give me her data and then I would immediately remove the identifiers, then that would fit under category 4. If Dr. Miller had plenty of time and she could give me a de-identified data set to do research with, then that would be not human subject research. So it's secondary analysis, and it all depends on whether you have identifiers versus no identifiers. This is not a part of the IRB, but I do think it's very important for all researchers, especially doctoral students, to kind of hear this. If you are receiving data from someone or an entity, it is your job to make sure that that data was collected in an ethical manner. Because if something would happen and a research misconduct investigation started happening, even if you didn't collect the data or get, you know, if you just received the data, you have an ethical obligation to make sure that that was upheld. And if that person is found guilty and you use that data, you will be going down with them. One of the worst research misconducts And I don't know, Dr. Evola could tell you the website, I forget it, but there is a website that shows all individuals that have been accused and found guilty of research misconduct. The guy that is listed the most on there has his grad students on there because he falsified data and he gave his falsified data to his grad students for research. So not only did he ruin his career, but he ruined all of his grad students' careers. And so I just think that, like, if somebody's not willing to tell you how they got the data or they collected the data, how they consented, even show their IRB approval letter to you, I would walk away from that data. It is not worth it. So just kind of be careful with that. So category 5 is research and demonstration projects that are done by the federal department of, or agency. We don't have one of these at Tech, so I'm not even going to bother with it. The 6th one is taste and food quality evaluation. So in animal science, we do a lot of tasting of meat, of seasoning, all of that kind of good stuff. And so it falls under this category. 3D printing of food is starting to get really big. And so as long as the ingredients are FDA approved, then they can fall through the exempt category on that. Alcohol, though, has to go expedited. So the wine tasting goes expedited. So I do have a slide, Dr. Miller, and I don't know if you want me to talk about it, but about just external collaborations, or we want to wait and we can dive into answering questions.
Let's kind of wait on that and we can dive into questions.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen then, and I'm ready to answer questions.
Anybody have any questions?
Oh, and I will, Dr. Robertson, you told me to talk on this and then I didn't do it, but our office now offers human subject training, and we do it in the fall and spring semesters, about 3 to 4 weeks into the semester beginning. So once you kind of figure out what the semester is going to look like, we do a series of 5 weeks, about an hour, hour and a half a week of trainings. And so the first one is very similar to what we talked about tonight, maybe a little bit more in depth, just an introduction to the IRB. The second week is navigating Cayuse IRB and how that system works at Texas Tech. Then the third week is talking about data collection and privacy. The fourth week is recruitment and consent. And then the fifth week is the wrap up where we talk about, like, after IRB approval, what does this mean for us? It is general, but it is specific to Texas Tech. And so I try to talk about federal regulations and why we do the things we do, but it really is specific to Texas Tech. And if you're nervous about, you know, you hear the horror stories about the IRB and I don't know, y'all think we're awful. We're not, I promise, we're here to help. But if you do that 5-week series, I feel like it can guide you through the IRB process. Ideally, if you've got a project, you could leave every single session and know how to complete an IRB. And so that's our goal, is to kind of let you know what we're thinking, what we're expecting. And I try to give real life examples of what I'm currently dealing with. And so just kind of a good foundation.
And Aubrey asked, are you going to do it virtually again, Dr. Street?
Yeah, so what we do, I mean, I do love to do in-person teaching. I mean, the Zoom's great, but I definitely prefer in-person. So we'll probably do 2 sessions in person, and then 1 session at night will be through Zoom.
And it is great training. And I think the best part of it for me, Dr. Street, was the human subjects aspect. I mean, that's a part that you don't really realize how important that is, and that you're very cognizant of what you're doing with human subjects, and how easily you can get into trouble if you're not careful.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I don't know, Aubrey, if you're a distance student or if you're on campus, but I will say, like, the distance students, they're a little bit more quiet. They don't ask as much questions. Whereas, like, when Dr. Miller took the class, we were in the library, and I mean, the researchers were asking the questions, and I really think that you start to learn from one another. And every once in a while they tell a horror story that they've heard of, which is also kind of fun and interesting to listen to.
Well, and maybe I drove Dr. Street crazy because I stayed on just about every night afterwards and asked extra questions because I didn't want to tie up everybody's time related, because not a lot of people do prisoner research. So, but they were very accommodating to answering questions even online, and giving you the time that you need to answer your question. So I thank you for that.
No, it is good. That is like on the Zoom ones, definitely people stay afterwards. Like in Dr. Miller's in the face-to-face, I think we went down a couple of rabbit holes just in the middle of the session, so, which is good. It's totally fine.
Any other questions anybody has? I thought she did a pretty good job explaining everything pretty well.
Well, I'm sure I skipped over something. Sometimes weirdly enough, this is now becoming my life.
Poodle disappointed us. We were expecting him to keep showing up, and we're waiting for it.
I felt like she was, I mean, this is my bed now. I mean, like, he's doing some damage back there.
All right. I was in one the other night with somebody's cat walked across their computer screen. So,
Well, I think when I did the training, she was just a little puppy. So she was in my lap most of the time at the beginning of the semester. Clearly now that can't happen.
All right, if there's not any other questions, let's give Dr. Street a round of applause. We really appreciate you so much. This is really helpful. I know some of the ones who are not on right now, and I know they just probably finished final exams not too long ago, so they're probably exhausted. But I know this particular recording is going to be viewed a lot. So we just want to let you know, we have about 35 doctoral students, so we have quite a few. So, and some of them in their beginning stages, and some getting ready to do qualifying exams, and then some that are right now working on their dissertations. So I know all of that you talked about. So just be prepared. You may get a lot of emails.
Perfect. I love it. Anytime.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, or this evening, I should say. We appreciate Dr. Street so much, you coming and doing this for us. I know this is so helpful for our doctoral students. So we want to thank all of you too that could join us as well. Aubrey, Nicole, Star, thank you so much. And we look forward, we'll let you know when our next year's doctoral symposiums, and too, if you have any suggestions for symposiums you'd like to see, please email Dr. Robertson and I, and so that way we can start planning for those for the next school year. All right. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dr. Street.
Good night, everybody.